L'idée, donc, mon rôle maintenant, donc, je me représente, Dominic 𝘍𝘳𝘍𝘬𝘍, professeur au département d'histoire de l'art, je vais me ralentir, de l'Université du Québec à Montréal. En particulier, j'ai le poste d'histoire et historiographie de l'art au Québec, /Canada, avant 1900. Donc, c'est l'intitulé de mon poste. Et en relation avec cette fonction, j'ai souvent eu à enseigner un cours qui traite de l'histoire de l'art au Québec, /Canada, depuis Contact, environ la première décennie du XVIIe siècle, jusqu'à environ 1860. Et ensuite, un deuxième cours qui a aussi été beaucoup enseigné par notre collègue Esther Trépanier, qui va de 1860 à 1940. Pierre-Olivier Ouellet a enseigné ces deux cours, lui aussi, plusieurs fois. Et en réfléchissant au magnifique programme, donc l'entrée en jeu qu'on vient d'entendre, à laquelle on vient d'assister, déjà éveille toutes sortes de questionnements. Mais le questionnement qui était au cœur de la préoccupation pour cette table ronde est celle de l'enseignement. So, but what do we do with works like this? The very rich questionings that come out of the papers that we've heard so far are quite similar in scope and in nature to the ones that will come up in an undergraduate class and also further on in graduate work. And over the years, a work like this, with its special mysteries around its provenance, its the person who made it, its authorship, all the things that we've already heard about, is also, has been in my case anyway, a space for opening the discussions around contact, around what some have called, Richard White and Ruth Phillips have used this term, the middle ground of cultures in presence with one another, mutually transformed by their co-presence. The issues of representation, of sources, also invariably, in my experience, open up to questions from students about the visual and material cultural practices of First Nations, of the Wendat, of Algonquin peoples, of Anishinaabe, Ojibwe. And the experience that I've had over the years is that I will not present myself as an expert capable of answering in detail those questions, but I use my teaching as a way of knowing that the doors are being opened, to point towards the doors, help people walk through the doors, and tell them about other expertises that are growing, that are in place, that we need to bring in to the classroom in order to do the work that they would like to do, that we would all like to do. So it's a course that in my experience has been evolving in this direction. From the first time I taught it in 2009, and I taught it again last year, and I hope to teach it again in the future. Mais c'est extrêmement important, en fait, qu'on soit une communauté de travail sur ces questions. Et le fait de pouvoir collaborer, de parler avec un Pierre-Olivier Ouellet, avec Laurier Lacroix, qui a aussi eu la responsabilité, avant que j'arrive à l'UQAM, je crois, d'un cours comme celui-là, et certainement nous a donné tant de ressources par ses travaux pour l'enseignement et pour le cadrage sensible et intelligent des questions, doit, à mon esprit, venir à la rencontre des expertises qui sont en construction, en développement, qui sont en place depuis longtemps, en fait. Des expertises dans les communautés des Premières Nations, les savoirs qui ne sont pas gratuits, qui exigent une collaboration, un co-développement de chantier pour transformer l'expérience éducative et la mission éducative qui est incarnée dans des cours comme ces cours de premier cycle. Donc c'est à partir de là que l'idée est venue de réunir l'organisateur principal du colloque, Pierre-Olivier Ouellet, avec deux personnes avec qui j'ai parlé au fil des années, Farrell Racette de l'University of Regina et Annette de Stecher, l'University of Colorado, Boulder. Alors, je vais les présenter et ensuite leur lancer une question assez générale, en commençant, je pense, par Pierre-Olivier, pour partir to start from where we are, the situation that we're experiencing here. But then in order to open up to the different considerations, the different ways of teaching in the undergraduate programs that Sherry Farrell-Racette has experienced and that Annette Stecher has experienced. And then after that first general tour de table, we can open up the discussion to the floor, I think, and to other questions. So I'd like to begin by presenting Sherry Farrell-Racette, who is an interdisciplinary scholar with an active arts and curatorial practice. Her work is grounded in story, stories of people, stories that objects tell, painting stories, telling stories, and finding stories. She has done extensive work in archives and museum collections with an emphasis on retrieving women's voices and recovering knowledge. Most recently, she was cross-appointed to the Department of Native Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Manitoba, and has also had an extensive career in Saskatchewan education, working at Suntep Regina, First Nations University of Canada, and the University of Regina. She remains committed to experiential learning and Indigenous pedagogies. She is also the curator of an exhibition that will be opening on this Saturday at the Centre d'Art Daphne, Daphne Art Center. We're one of the co-sponsors of this event. So we're very fortunate to also have the curator of an exhibition opening this weekend with us today. Professor Annette Stecher, on the screen, is an American art scholar. Her focus, histories of integrated visual arts across cultures. Professor Stecher is a specialist in women's histories and critical museology, historical and contemporary practices of museum representation. Her courses cover historical and contemporary American and Indigenous visual arts topics, as well as graduate seminars in critical museology and exhibition practices. The study of collections and exhibitions at the Denver Art Museum, the Colorado University Art Museum, and the Colorado University Museum of Natural History are an integral part of her coursework. Her book, When That Women's Art, is forthcoming in February 2022 with McGill Queen's University Press. It's been supported by several awards, Millard Mice Awards and the Shirk Awards and a Caden Award. Her book in progress is Chiefly Gifts, The Power of Trade Silver, 1750 to 1820, which has been supported by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute. Enfin, ici à ma gauche, l'historien de l'art et muséologue Pierre-Olivier Ouellet, spécialiste dans l'étude de l'art au Québec et au Canada. Il a un parcours académique ponctué par des études dans plusieurs disciplines du domaine des arts, ayant effectué 2 baccalauréats, en art visuel et en histoire de l'art. Après l'obtention d'une maîtrise en muséologie, il a reçu son doctorat en histoire de l'art de l'Université de Rennes 2 en 2013 pour sa thèse intitulée « Circulation, usage et fonction des œuvres d'art par les civils et les militaires en Nouvelle-France de 1608 à 1759 ». Les recherches de Pierre-Olivier Ouellet mettaient alors en évidence une continuité culturelle entre la France et la Nouvelle-France en ce qui concerne les pratiques de collectionnement et les rôles symboliques associés aux objets d'art. En plus de ce parcours académique, Pierre-Olivier Ouellet est actif dans le milieu muséal depuis 2003, ayant notamment collaboré à de nombreuses occasions avec le Musée national des beaux-arts du Québec, notamment à titre de membre externe du comité externe d'acquisition pour l'art ancien et moderne de 2007 à 2013. Il a été également commissaire des expositions Art et Dévotion, les reliquaires à Paprol, et de Métis appelant les trésors artistiques des Hospitalières, présentés au Musée des Hospitalières de l'Hôtel-Dieu de Montréal. Soulignons enfin qu'il a obtenu, je pense que c'était en 2017, le financement dans le programme Savoir du Conseil de recherche et sciences humaines du Canada, pardonnez-moi, pour un travail très important sur le peintre, sur François-Albert Roger, notamment en tant que peintre, n'est-ce pas? Oui. Oui, et donc un projet complété qui a déjà donné lieu à plusieurs résultats de recherche, dont un numéro du carnet de l'équipe de recherche en histoire de l'art du Québec. Alors, thank you very much, all of you, for accepting this invitation to take part in this discussion. So Pierre-Olivier will speak in French, Annette and Sherry in English. I will, if necessary, you just have to say the word and I will pick up a ball and translate it a bit in summary, if necessary. But let's begin then. I'm going to ask you, Pierre-Olivier, to reflect, if you would, with us on what it has meant for you to teach with this object. Clearly, it's led you to where we are today, and there's a very important student participation, which is a great contribution itself to the program for today and tomorrow. But what has it meant to be in the classroom with this object and to work with these issues around opening, as teachers, our own spirit and teaching practices to the paradigms that come with making a space for the consciousness of Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, Inuit history in our courses and with our students, some of whom will be from First Nations, Métis, Inuit communities. But what does it mean to make that space together? Thank you for considering this question.
Merci, merci Dominic pour cette présentation. Donc, très bonne question également. En fait, je commencerai en mentionnant que justement ce cours dont il est question, qui est offert pour les étudiants au baccalauréat ici à l'UQAM, donc un cours qui est, comme l'a mentionné Dominic, donc les arts au Québec, donc / Canada, voilà, donc avant 1860. Donc c'est un cours que j'avais eu l'occasion de donner pour la première fois alors que j'étais au doctorat en histoire de l'art, donc en 2006 ou 2007, si ma mémoire est bonne. Et bon, c'était un moment où quand même j'étais encore assez proche, je veux dire en termes de temps, de mes études aussi au baccalauréat en histoire de l'art. Donc, c'est-à-dire qu'il y avait à peine 3-4 ans, là, que j'avais 4-5 ans, que j'avais gradué du baccalauréat. Donc, j'avais encore quand même en tête assez clairement le cours que j'avais reçu à l'époque, qui avait été donné justement par Robert de Rome. Et donc, il s'agissait quand même pour moi à l'époque de reprendre ce cours et de tenter quand même de trouver une lecture, un fil conducteur, donc par rapport à cette synthèse qu'on peut faire de l'histoire de l'art avant 1860 sur notre territoire. Et qu'est-ce qui est intéressant, donc à travers ces cours qu'on est amené donc à donner à diverses occasions, donc au cours de sa carrière, donc ce sont des cours auxquels, dans le fond, on va faire des ajouts au fur et à mesure qu'on va progresser dans le temps, et également donc à travers différentes dimensions à la fois de recherche, mais aussi de sensibilité qui vont être amenées à varier à travers le temps. Une des choses qui a été marquante par rapport à ce cours et par rapport à l'enseignement que j'allais en faire, c'est surtout matérialisé dans la conscience des productions artistiques autochtones. Donc, le fait de se rendre compte que justement ce cours initialement ne présentait pas vraiment donc d'aspects associés justement aux pratiques artistiques autochtones et qui était donc notamment quand même fortement intéressante et à souligner notamment dans la réalité coloniale donc de la Nouvelle-France. Et cet aspect donc saisi comme étant donc dans le fond un élément manquant de cette histoire a permis finalement de développer un certain savoir sur le sujet. Je me présente évidemment pas comme étant un spécialiste des arts autochtones en soi, mais n'empêche qu'il me semblait évident qu'un apport devait être fait à cet égard. Donc, à travers cette recherche, à travers donc cette volonté de m'intéresser à ces aspects, à travers les lectures donc des livres, notamment de Jonathan Lenné sur les wampum, ou encore les travaux de Christian Feast, ou encore Nicolas Péné, également donc les ouvrages essentiels également de, pour faire par exprès, j'oublie le nom, mais donc sur les arts en Amérique du Nord, les arts autochtones, arts premiers. Donc, c'est trouvé finalement à être matérialisé tout un ensemble de connaissances justement sur ces productions qui rendaient compte que dans le fond, voilà, manquer à cet aspect venait aussi dénaturer la connaissance qu'on peut avoir de l'art à l'époque de la Nouvelle-France. puisque, effectivement, pendant tout le 17e siècle, on a un rapport qui va être étroit du fait des contacts entre autochtones, également colonisateurs, découvreurs, explorateurs. Et comment donc aborder la question notamment qui a été soulevée par François-Marc Gagnon, donc comment en se rattachant à l'historiographie, aux recherches également de nos prédécesseurs, donc comment aborder ces aspects donc relatifs notamment à la conversion par l'image qui va être effectuée des Autochtones, sans nécessairement donc quand même connaître davantage la réalité autochtone de cette époque et également les œuvres qui vont être associées à leur culture. Donc après, voilà, cette prise de conscience de ma part concernant cette réalité, en voyant que dans le fond, tout se répondait aussi à quelque part. Donc le fait qu'on se retrouve notamment avec des pièces de sculpture en argent qui vont être présentées aux Autochtones au 17e siècle, et que l'on sache notamment qu'à travers donc la sensibilité qu'on peut retrouver dans l'ère culturelle de l'Est, dans laquelle justement, même aussi à travers les perles de coquillage, il y a cet effet de brillance qui va être particulièrement parlante pour la sensibilité autochtone. Donc, cette sensibilité qui va faire en sorte que cette brillance va être vue comme étant donc un monde à la fois donc de lumière, mais également d'ombre, et ayant donc à ce moment-là certaines vertus. Donc, de comprendre cet aspect et finalement de comprendre finalement beaucoup mieux les logiques aussi qui vont être mises de l'avant par les jésuites à travers les choix esthétiques qu'ils vont faire, donc permettait, somme toute, de rendre le cours non seulement plus cohérent, donc à travers les interprétations qu'on pouvait mettre de l'avant, mais d'enrichir nécessairement aussi cette connaissance de cette période de l'histoire de l'art. Donc, à travers cet apport, je dois admettre qu'il y a donc plusieurs possibilités, évidemment, de questionnements qui peuvent surgir. Et jusqu'à un certain point, bon, peut-être que ma pratique va être différente, et bon, je l'espère, évidemment, de Chérie, également d'Annette et même de Dominic, dans la mesure où mon attitude donc en classe n'était pas nécessairement donc d'amener un point dans lequel on devait être nécessairement dans une posture critique par rapport justement à ces héritages. Les héritages donc associés justement à la colonisation. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a quand même donc cet aspect qui va être présent et qui pouvait être soulevé par les étudiants et que jusqu'à un certain point, je pouvais donc stimuler par la suite à travers des travaux. Mais donc l'idée était plutôt pour moi d'avoir donc davantage la curiosité, l'ouverture et de stimuler ces aspects-là chez les étudiants à travers donc ces pistes possibles. Donc d'être un petit peu plus dans un rapport nomade là, par rapport à l'enseignement ou dans le fond, voilà, donc je laisse davantage cette possibilité là, de recherche.
I will just try to pick that up and resume it, but among the closing remarks of Pierre-Olivier's comments, and you will correct me if I've misunderstood, but I sense the adoption of a posture of humility. In other words, that charging ourselves with working with a painting such as La France apportant la foi, with also the questions coming from our students and with our own interrogations, but how we can reconfigure our teaching to include research about the material and visual cultures of First Nations. Effectively, we are saying to our students, in many respects, we are not here presenting ourselves as experts who are going to give you the truth. We are co-researchers with you. We adopt a position of humility because in any case, it's the position that we need to adopt. And that in many ways, I think that's, if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly.
Tu l'interprètes encore mieux que qu'est-ce que j'ai pu dire, alors tant mieux.
So I will ask, I know that in doing so, that has actually built bonds of trust with the students in terms of that interrogation and then their own work that they're going to do. So now, Sherry, you've taught in many different contexts. I haven't had the chance to ask you if you've ever worked with this particular painting, but you you have perhaps been working with these similar issues. You've taught here in Montreal at Concordia University, in Manitoba, in Saskatchewan, and in other configurations, and also your practice as an artist, I'm sure, has brought you into environments where many of these issues arise, but perhaps in different ways. What is your own perspective on that then? And what would you like to tell us about with whom are we teaching and why? Thank you very much.
Well, it changes. I know for myself, I've never taught this particular work, although the next time I teach colonial representation, I'm going to include it. This, as a viewer, as someone who goes into, galleries, this is the kind of painting that I would have rolled my eyes and walked past, because it falls within, this pretty vast number of, yet another image of an Indigenous person kneeling / reclining, welcoming, joyfully colonial subjugation. And one of the things that I've been, blessed, I suppose, to have encountered through oral tradition, but also historic documents, which affirmed my own responses, we weren't all that impressed with y'all. There wasn't like this idea, if you looked at the colonial representation, it's like we fell to our knees as soon as someone got off a boat. And, that isn't true. The other sobering reminder is the role of the Catholic Church in determining our very humanity, which was the first task that they were charged with. So that's always sobering as an Indigenous person. But in terms of myself, I'm also implicated in this history because my family is mentioned in the Catholic mission records in this place going back to the early 18th century. So my lineages on both my mother and father's side basically start from Algonquin Park through 𝘞𝘦𝘯𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝑍𝑒𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑘𝑚𝑒𝑠 Témiscamingue, and so of course we're in the colonial record and we converted to Catholicism. So we have this fraught relationship. I think the question that I always come back to is, first of all, let's look at the position and where people are at and who is the painting for. So, is it celebratory colonialism, which we get a lot of, or is it something else? And one of the things, and I just sort of tossed this out to Anne, because what I was thinking of was, what was the context of the painting? And so we've looked at the possible date of 1666. That's a decade before the wampum belt, the large wampum belt that's at Chartres, was created and gifted in 1676, and also within the lifespan of 𝘞𝘦𝘯𝘐𝘕𝘠𝑗𝑗, who lived between 1656 and 1680. So if we look at all of those events happening around the gifting of the painting, we can kind of see it as an object in an object narrative. Painting comes here, wampum belt goes there. And then I created a work of art in response to an exhibition that Ryan Rice curated called Soul Sister. And it was asking for artists to respond to 𝘞𝘦𝘯𝘬𝘠𝑗. And because there were a lot of Mohawk artists, I thought, well, I can't tell that story. So I came at it from an Algonquin perspective because her mother is Algonquin and I'm a member of Témiscamingue First Nation. And so I dove into the Jesuit relations and really encountered the grim history that was happening in this time period where, it's kind of, I don't know if it's bad luck or ironic to talk about a pandemic in the context of a pandemic. But I would lean towards identifying the figure as a woman. And I know people have mentioned that it seems gender ambiguous, and women were often portrayed very masculine in these early representations, but the double braid on the crown of the head suggests to me a female. And most of the early converts were women. So when we look at who with their first role of, the first round of baptisms, and I know going through the early records, just how hard life was, and that people saw the mission not so much as a shift in belief, although they did take comfort from it, in some cases, a woman was the only survivor in her family. And in another case that really stuck with me, she was the only survivor of her nation. And those are the women who came to the missions. And they were literally rebuilding their lives, like literally rebuilding their lives. And the routine of the mission and the routine of Catholic ritual, going to church, praying, it brought some kind of structure to their lives for them to start rebuilding. But I think the notion of how deeply, I mean, that really ranges. I was just thinking about my grandma who, during a thunderstorm, because the thunder beings are a very important and, presence, my grandmother would take holy water and sprinkle it around the house. So this is not your typical Catholic thing, right? And then I had my ex-husband was laughing when I told him, he said that his grandma would burn palm fronds the way that people burn sweetgrass and do that, so that we're engaging in ancient practices, communicating with ancient deities using kind of the materials of Catholicism, so that there's this kind of syncretic thing. I think when we teach, what I find anyways, it really depends on my students. That's the context, because I have just been gifted over the number of years with a lot of stories, and it's like they have to earn the stories. Sometimes if I don't think they're ready, I won't teach them. So there isn't any set thing. It's really how far are the students willing to go? How open are they? How many Indigenous students are in the class? That's the other thing, because I've really had to wrestle in some cases with, if I have a class full of entirely non-Indigenous folks, and where are they at with everything, to a room where maybe all or 80% are Indigenous, right? So that actually changes, because with Indigenous students, I find if you can build the right relationship, they will bring things. So I had, my favorite class was a group where we would just put things on the table. In the last class of the week, I would just say, "Oh, what do you think about this?" And they would all phone their grandma, go home and visit, call their uncle, and they were very diverse: Dene, Cree, Métis, like Dakota, because I was teaching at First Nations University. And then first class of the following week, we get at the table and was, "Well, I phoned my grandma." And then we would have a really good conversation, so that really that idea, I think, of being the co-searcher is, works very well if you can, but it relies on trust and respect. You don't always get that. You should always try to give it, but you don't always get it in return.
I've had the privilege of having conversations with you in the past, Annette, and I can already hear some resonant moments between what Sherry has said and Pierre-Olivier and your own experience while working, after doing all your master's and doctoral work in Canada and Ontario and working in Quebec and with the community at 𝘢𝘕𝘐𝑷𝑒𝑐𝑖. You've been in the United States for several years now. You have a very different experience than ours. So would you take up where Sherry has brought us and share with us what your own teaching experience and philosophy has become in relation to your student communities? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dominic. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here today. And I'd like to thank Dominic for inviting me. And I'd like to thank all of your team, Dominic, for the work to organize the conference. I'm enjoying the talks very much, and I'm learning all the time. I've been teaching now here in Colorado. Thank goodness, it's been a long time. It's now 7 years. And I think the teaching here probably is a little bit different. Most of the students who I teach, whether at the graduate level or undergrad, even though I'm teaching upper level courses, have very little background in Indigenous histories and often very little awareness of Indigenous presence. So from that point, I want to state that I'm joining you from the territories of the Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne nations, and at least 50 other nations who today make Colorado their home. And I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge, because when I teach, when I say that to my students, many of them didn't know that's news. They don't know that. So I'm actually, what you said, Sherry, really resonated for me. I sort of take as my starting point where I find the students who are joining me in the class. And what often happens, in fact, it happens every semester, is that by about the semesters here are 16 weeks long. So about halfway through the semester, students will come up to me after class and share with me the Indigenous community, their heritage. And I think that it's just maybe a different atmosphere of comfort about Indigenous identity. So from that, my approach is talking to students and thinking of it like like I know what you said, Sherry, as well. I think of it that way too. I don't see myself as an expert, and I see myself as learning all the time. And often students bring fresh eyes to things that I may have looked at or thought about. And a student who's never seen it before or discussed it will have a new insight that will just sort of make a click. So I think of myself as co-learner and co-researchers with my students at all levels. And I think one of the things that I start from and grounds at, again, at all levels, whether it's an introductory survey or PhD student, is a method of thinking always of reading against the grain. So even though, for example, in looking at the painting La France, it's thinking, and there's extensive discourse around it, it's thinking that it can be seen very differently, and thinking, so where is the voice and perspective of the Indigenous community, or in this instance, maybe Wendat community of the time, and who was this painting actually intended for? Like, who was the intended viewer? And I keep in mind Alan Greer, historian, and what he said, and just as one instance about the Jesuits, that they exaggerated their role in communities, particularly the Wendat community, and the importance and the influence that they had. So I sort of use that as an example to think that, you know, whatever the historical text, you know, whether it's an archival source or whether it's, you know, a fairly recent secondary source, or looking at a European painting, that we're always reading against the grain, right? We're reading against the voice of the dominant culture and the dominant narrative, and to just always be asking questions. And so I think, you know, like you too, Sherry, I keep going back to the archives and thinking about traditions. And, you know, I was rereading that article, and it struck me, there's that reference to the Jesuit journal and the Wendat community giving those, I think it was 4 or 5 gifts. And it immediately made me think back to another text. And it's a book by a Wendat historian, Marguerite Vincent Tariolina. And in it, she talks about gifts that were given to the Ursuline sisters when their convent burned down. And those gifts that were given were numerous strands of wampum. And one of them was given, then the speaker specifies, to encourage the sisters to stay, not to return home to their families, because, you know, they had lost their where they lived. And the other one was given, and it states that the other strands of wampum were given to build the foundations of a new convent for them. So I was thinking that gifts in this instance were gifts of wampum, they're very specific purposes. And I was thinking it's possible that the gifts that were described in the Jesuit were also similarly gifts of wampum that were given sort of in almost metaphorically to further specific interests, but weren't actual, the gifts as they might have been interpreted. So I'm always thinking about how we see things differently, and also rethinking interpretations in light of sort of new dialogues or new texts that have come out from Wendat scholars and from other scholars that are really revising sort of more established narratives. And I think that sort of, for example, a text by Catherine McGee that was relooking at the role of the Women's Council in the decisions of relocation in 1649, the Wendat Women's Council. And so thinking about the authority and the great thought the decisions were made with, and so rethinking words, like thinking of refugee and rethinking that, and thinking about why the Wendat made choices. And it, the move towards Quebec could easily well have been to be closer to longtime Indigenous allies who were near Quebec. So I try to encourage students to rethink everything, right? Not take anything as given and just try to think of it differently, always aware that most of the time what we're reading is coming from a very colonial standpoint. And so it's trying to think away from that and not necessarily against it all the time, but just to always have that questioning approach to think, okay, why was that said? And is there another perspective? And there is another voice? And how can we find that voice and think about it differently? So I think it's really, it's sometimes a little difficult because I find often I'm working against some really ingrained stereotypes, but it's very exciting and I enjoy the teaching very much. And I also enjoy seeing students learn new things and come away from the class with just, a really fresh understanding and a new way of seeing shared histories, right? Seeing the histories of Indigenous communities, where I am right now in the States, and then thinking about how they can re-understand that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Sherry. Merci, Pierre-Olivier. Given the state of the educational systems, and this will be different in the United States again, obviously, what is the percentage of students who are Indigenous, who are in our classes? This too will be different from one province to another, from one region to another. And I think given, so either the small percentage or the large percentage, what are the issues around also around the percentages of Indigenous presence, Métis, Inuit, in teaching itself? Is that right? So l'enseignement et les personnes qui sont le bassin étudiant.
When I taught at Concordia when did I go? From 2006 to 2009, Jason Lewis and I were the only Indigenous faculty, I think, in the entire province. So very humble beginnings, and that has changed. That has changed. But I think what I found myself, and I find myself going back to it, I taught in Indigenous controlled post-secondary institutions and, the ordinary university system, and also programs within those. So when I was at the University of Manitoba, I was with the Department of Native Studies, and that's where, let's say I'd be teaching a class on Indigenous women and 25 out of 27 students would be women, and 23 of those would be Indigenous, to what is now Canada. So in that case, it was very different. I'm at Regina now, and the percentage of Indigenous students in my class would be, sometimes only 1, sometimes 3. I think I really rocked it with 4. At Concordia, it was the same kind of thing where if I had, a large introductory class, maybe I'd have 4 or 5 students. Of course, they wouldn't all immediately identify, and that's, you were mentioning that where I had one, someone see my grandmother's Abenaki, or, and I had one student who did an assignment and her dad helped her and she didn't seem to know, but I thought, how did you get access to this? And he was like, those are my dad's friends. And I was like, no, I think those are your dad's cousins. But he was opening up a side of his life to her as his almost adult daughter, but they were just obviously embarking on that process. So there's many delicate kinds of negotiations that happen. I think that funding, post-secondary funding, just to get people in the door is always a challenge, and also still getting people through high school. So there's still many challenges just to create that student body. Yeah, there's still many challenges, but it's growing. we just had, I mean, seriously, we just had in Saskatchewan a major scholar outed as being falsely identified. And so that is actually a challenge that we have at institutions, that in our eagerness to fill positions for funding students, for creating jobs, for hiring people, that appears to be vulnerable for people to misrepresent themselves. And I sometimes think universities are vulnerable to it because they don't want to have a failed search. They don't want to admit that they can't give that Indigenous scholarship that year because there are no applicants. You know, like we don't want to admit that we have this myth of progress, and sometimes we have to look at the larger challenges that are happening. The thing that I find the biggest difference, and it's growing slowly, is that it used to be that when an Indigenous student came into a class, they felt very uncomfortable, often experienced hostility directly. As an Indigenous faculty, I've been the target of racism from my students. Personally, I find faculties of fine arts to be real havens compared to, and this is terrible to say, faculties of education are dreadful, which is so ironic because these are the people who will be teaching our children. But I've had some pretty hairy experiences in faculties of education. But art students seem to be different, art historians, and the more people are open, then they create a softer place for the Indigenous students to come in. And so it's like the work that we do with our, with ourselves, with our non-Indigenous colleagues, creating that openness where you can see in 2 years we have come so far just in terms of attitude and knowledge growth. That's going to facilitate the entry of Indigenous colleagues, whether they come in as faculty or whether they come in as students. But I've been in this business for a long time, and I do see progress, but I also see continuing challenges. Well, because we're still poor. I mean, that's I suppose the bottom line, and the quality of education can be uneven. We need to work harder. I used to think Quebec, coming from Saskatchewan, even though my family's from here, I used to think when I first came here, I thought this is like the 1960s on the prairies. That sounds harsh. But I'm very heartened, sort of since 2009 when I left, so say a decade, a little bit in a decade, there's been a pretty remarkable movement, and that's really heartening to see.
Annette, would you like to pick up the speaking stick, and then we'll come to Pierre-Olivier and myself.
Thank you. Thank you. That's it's a great question. And so for Colorado University Boulder, there's a very, very small population of any minority group at all. It's a major, it's only just being recognized as something that has to be addressed, and like I'm saying, in the last 2 years, like recognized. So I think I wouldn't know if there were it seems that Indigenous students decide not to identify. So I feel really honored when halfway through the semester, a student would come to me after class or have a meeting and share with me their Indigenous heritage. But I don't know that our campus actually feels like a safe place for many minority students. And I'm hoping that that's going to change. Our department just recently just began a scholarship for diversity students, minority students. And there are 2 faculty members who are Indigenous, Melanie Yazzie, who's a Navajo artist, and Anna Zularakis, who is a Lakota artist as well. So our faculty are there. It's actually a lot like what Sherry was saying. It's like helping just students finishing high school and then seeing the university as a place they want to be, or a place that would welcome them. Because I don't think, that now I'm speaking of CU Boulder, other universities might be different, but I don't think it's necessarily being seen as a place where communities might want to send their youth. And there is a Center for Native American Indigenous Studies, which is getting more and more funding, and they are trying to build connections with communities and to build connections with high schools and to build that bridge between the university and the communities in Colorado. But it seems like it's something that's really just beginning now.
Merci bien, Annette. Alors, Pierre-Olivier, je passe la...
À ce niveau, j'ai aussi demandé à Dominic de contribuer parce que voilà, donc les expériences peuvent être différentes et complémentaires, là. Donc, il reste que justement, en termes de réalité de population étudiante, population autochtone, sincèrement, je dois admettre que c'est donc une information qui n'est pas nécessairement donc soulevée, mise en évidence dans le cadre des cours et en même temps donc il n'y a pas nécessairement donc cette affirmation là, justement de la part des étudiants, des étudiantes de dire qu'ils sont d'origine autochtone. Donc à ce moment-là, on navigue un petit peu dans ce flou en considérant bon quand même en considérant l'ensemble de la classe, bien, c'est sûr que des questions de respect, de manière à ne pas offusquer, à ne pas justement créer de situations là, qui seraient complexes, là, donc par rapport à ces, donc au traitement par exemple de la représentation, quand même justement qui peut être très dérangeante des Autochtones, également des termes qui sont utilisés par les missionnaires à des époques reculées où on utilisait carrément le mot de sauvage. Donc, il y avait quand même donc ici des questions qui étaient présentes et qui faisaient en sorte que, bon, étant donné qu'on ne sait pas exactement donc qui se trouve à être en classe, donc il y a toujours quand même voilà, un certain questionnement par rapport aux termes qu'on doit utiliser. Tout comme ça va l'être aussi. En fait, je dois dire que je me suis fait reprendre par rapport à certains termes utilisés en classe qui étaient davantage en relation avec la religion catholique, donc où là, il y avait davantage cette présence un petit peu critique. Là, donc, si j'amenais des éléments, et pourtant, je faisais donc en toute honnêteté intellectuelle et avec justement ici non pas un parti pris, mais tout simplement de rendre les informations telles qu'elles sont. Mais ceci dit, pour revenir donc à la question davantage autochtone, il reste que en fait, je pense qu'on pourrait saluer donc l'initiative qui a été mise d'avant ici à l'UQAM de Jean-Philippe Uzel, qui justement pour un cours concernant les approches artistiques contemporaines et actuelles en art autochtone, donc a décidé justement de laisser son cours qu'il donnait habituellement 𝘕𝘰𝘶𝘷𝘦𝘭𝘭𝘦, donc de manière à ce que celui-ci puisse justement à ce moment-là apporter une nouvelle voix à ce volet d'histoire de l'art. Donc c'est le genre d'initiative que personnellement donc je trouve tout à fait formidable, qui permet comme ça justement de donner aussi l'occasion à ces spécialistes également, donc qui vont avoir peut-être une approche qui ne sera pas justement occidentale habituelle, pour pouvoir, du moins habituelle dans la façon dont on va enseigner les cours, pour amener donc à ce moment-là de nouveaux volets aussi d'exploration de cette réalité. Donc, Dominic, je peux te laisser la parole pour la suite.
Merci. C'est ça, je pense que mon expérience est en plusieurs points semblable à la tienne. Je me souviens à mes débuts d'enseignement de ce cours, c'était en 2009. Je pense qu'on l'a fait à cause du fait de cette prise de position que j'annonçais, hein, qui est celle de l'humilité et de l'accompagnement plutôt qu'autre chose. 2 personnes dans le premier groupe sont venues me voir, comme l'ont fait pour Annette, et m'ont dit, on est de la communauté Abénaki, on aimerait faire travailler avec ce qu'on connaît de Odanak, le musée Odanak, etc. Et puis, donc, elles étaient emballées, j'étais emballé, et puis ça s'est bien passé. Alors, ça ne se reproduit pas toutes les années, mais c'est le genre d'expérience qui, venant très tôt, m'a encouragé à continuer dans la même direction. Et je remarque notamment depuis je pense que je l'ai enseigné 7 fois, et à chaque année, ce sont les étudiantes et étudiants eux-mêmes qui choisissent de travailler sur des problématiques d'art autochtone historique, hein, pour lesquelles les sources ne sont pas nombreuses et mais pour lesquelles on a des sources secondaires ou des travaux comme celle de Ruth Phillips et d'autres, ou d'Annette, parce que je mets un des textes d'Annette dans mes plans de cours maintenant, etc. En fait, les textes de Louise Vigneault, de Laurier, il y a beaucoup de textes qui aident à faire éclore les questions. Et ce sont les questions, en fait, je pense, qui sont adoptées autant que les objets, mais les objets sont prisés aussi. Et en même temps, le deuxième volet de du cours qui me semble avoir pris une énorme importance, ce sont les broderies des Ursulines, qui sont considérées comme étant, je vais utiliser les mots juste parce que je n'en trouve pas d'autres pour le moment, mais les chefs-d'œuvre de l'époque. Et donc, qui ont un retentissement esthétique. Et je pense que c'est intéressant de voir que en plaçant les productions des Ursulines et les objets dont parle Annette, Ruth, etc., à l'avant-plan, il y a vraiment un effet, pas seulement esthétique, je dirais esthétique politique en ce moment, parce qu'autour d'un objet, mais notamment autour du concept de passation des savoirs de génération en génération dans une communauté, ça semble faire coalescer l'intérêt et la volonté de pousser plus loin. Et ça fait des retombées sur les autres productions, par exemple la famille Levasseur ou la famille Baillarger, cette notion de famille. Et donc, à travers les années, ma perspective s'est beaucoup changée autour vers une reconfiguration de la relation entre la production, la formation et la réception des productions artistiques. Il faut dire aussi que les dernières années ont été marquées. You've mentioned Jean-Philippe Uzel and the work he did with that course, bringing in 𝘕𝘰𝘶𝘷𝘦𝘭𝘭𝘦, and in other courses, he's showcased Indigenous contemporary artists, and they have been the guests for. You've talked about this with me before, Annette, about bringing artists in to be co-teachers and people with family traditions as well of making. And Jean-Philippe has also been involved with people like 𝘍𝘳𝘍𝘍𝘢 in religious studies and other professors around the university to set up, and with very important, with the First Nations Students Council, donc de l'UQAM, to set up the groupe de recherche interfacultaire, so an interfaculty research group on Indigenous affirmations. So and so that too is a cooperative model with in which the student body, such as it does declare itself and receives support from UQAM, is an integral part. And it's also part of the inter-university CRA, the Centre interuniversitaire des Études et de recherches autochtones. So you're right, there has been a lot of movement, Sherry, because I think there's been a lot of work right on the terrain of the classroom, and I think there's been a lot of behind the scenes work. And there has been hires at Concordia. Here, our new colleague, Caroline Nepton-Hutt, is now with us for a year and a half, 2 years. And so, yes, there is a shift definitely happening. And dans le contexte du Québec, avec son propre système et ses propres conditions politiques et économiques et sociales, et son propre histoire de relation avec ses communautés autochtones, voilà quelques indices d'un travail qui se fait sur le terrain et dans les coulisses et au niveau administratif, et on sait que ça prend à tous les niveaux, ce travail-là. Je pense que ça témoigne aussi d'une lente, mais certaine croissance, certaine dans le sens de certain, affirmatif, et non partiel, mais beaucoup de professeurs ont des relations de recherche coopérative avec les communautés, les différentes nations sur le territoire québécois, et je pense qu'on n'est pas encore arrivé à l'horizon ultime, mais ça va de mieux en mieux dans le sens d'une codéfinition des besoins de recherche. En fait, je pense que ça s'est transformé énormément. Les collègues en sociologie, en anthropologie, notre collègue Daniel Arsenault était très impliqué dans ces relations-là. Donc, c'est aussi c'est ce travail un à un, collègue avec collègue dans les communautés, les relations à long terme. It's a slow process, but it's happening at all levels, and I think that has helped things move forward because, again, the trust is there. And sometimes there's a breakthrough and things happen very fast, but it's because there's also been a lot of groundwork. I think everyone is sensitive. UQAM is undergoing a demographic dip, net loss in student registrations in recent years. Perhaps the faculty that demonstrates the greatest diversity, and by far, I think, is the Faculty of Business, the 𝘞𝘦𝘯𝘍𝘬𝘰𝘳𝘓, which has a truly international and highly diverse student body. And that faculty is 40% of the whole university. So that's, 40% of 38,000 students. That's quite something. And my personal feeling, and this is something I want to work on in the next few years, is that relationships with communities need to be built, not just at the university level, but it's come up here, high school, primary school. I think there's some work. We already have a very good collaboration with the CEGEPs in the art history department that has been growing over the last few years. It's all in the name of recruitment, of course, but it's also the name of sharing concerns. But I think there's something else that could be done that means an outreach to people who are running the school systems in different communities and showing that there are resources waiting for people who want to develop careers in research by their own communities, and that we can be just one modest tool among many at this level. But there might be things we can also do before people reach the university to assist with that. So that's again a long-term process. Mais voilà, une série de réflexions là-dessus. Would you address that, Annette, in terms of? Sorry,
Sir, I was following it, and then I came and went. I'm afraid I have not been around the French language now for a while. Could you just quickly summarize
Sure.
a question?
No, I was just talking about the many relationships that to see change happen. There are relationships that have to change, that change in the university, in the classroom, at the administrative level, and so on. But there are community relationships of many, many kinds that help us forward. And I was remembering that one of the things that you mentioned to me a few years ago was the importance of bringing artists into your classroom and their own exemplification to the students of family knowledge and transmission of knowledge.
Yes. Thank you, Dominic. And as this is a perfect question, tomorrow joining my undergrad survey course is Jan Jacobs, who is an Osage ribbon work artist and an elder. And she usually, at least once a year, she's very generous with her time in joining us. And she brings her collection of ceremonial ribbon work and also the generations from her mother, her aunts, and her grandmother and her great aunts that she has kept. And she shares with the student the techniques of making and then the histories of these wearing robes and what they've meant against, set against the struggles of the Osage community to survive going back into late 19th, early 20th centuries and before that, and the importance of women passing on their tradition and the knowledge of the dances that are wrapped up in the making and the wearing of the robes. So it just makes such a difference to students, I think, to hear Jan talk about these firsthand stories, and it makes it real in a way that me showing a PowerPoint or assigning readings it isn't the same. So I try to have as many speakers as I can join us in the classroom. A contemporary artist, Greg Deal, usually is able to join one of my classes every year, and he talks about his family and the traditions of art and his contemporary work. So I find that artists joining us in the classroom is probably one of the most powerful ways for students to really understand things differently and maybe see beyond the things that surround them the things that surround them. Mm-hmm. Thank you for asking about that.
Can I just send a question to Sherry? Do you have to be two people? The painter, is the painter, Sherry of Farrell Racette, allowed to come to the classroom where Sherry Farrell Racette, the other teacher, is teaching? Are you allowed to call on those things in devising experiences for your students?
I don't know. I suppose it all really comes from the research, right? So it all comes from the research. So whether the research is sort of living story, or whether it's archival research or museum collections research, because it's like I communicate how I process it. So some cases, my art making is the way I process my emotions. And sometimes it's about communicating knowledge. And sometimes that comes out in my writing, and sometimes that comes out in my teaching. Sometimes I show my students my art. But the other thing is that it can't be about you, right? So I have to be careful with that. What I have done also, as Annette talks about, is I have brought in like the practice of making. So I taught a class, an interdisciplinary class on beadwork, where we went to museum collections, we did beadwork, we read about beadwork, we read literature where beadwork was a symbol or a metaphor, and it was great. And I'm doing a class next spring called Radical Stitch, which is happening in concert with an exhibition of the same title, and we're stitching, right? And so I started, I've always done it, but when I taught at Concordia, I made my grad students bead. I actually made all my students bead, but I only beaded once in that big lecture theater with those little, kidneys. That was a bit of a disaster. So did that once, never did it again. But I could tell, like, when they have the experience, you have to be clear, like, I'm not giving this for you to appropriate, you don't have permission, but I want you to experience it. I want you to have the feeling of this work. And if you choose to carry on with it as a medium, go to your own people, for your inspiration, go to your own stories, don't take someone else's. And I would say virtually 100% students respect that. But what I love about doing that is when I take them to a museum, so like when you do that, then you go to the McCord. And they're the ones who bead are the ones with their noses against the glass going, holy crap, how did she do that? Mm-hmm. Because they truly see and understand what is underneath the pretty, because otherwise they just see pretty flowers or something. They don't see the intense labor and how hard it is, how much time to get to that level of execution. So I use making a lot. I would say it's fundamental. And for that, I use it, doesn't matter who I'm teaching. But I will give them rules. Like, I don't want to see you selling this stuff if you like, I'll be quite direct with them, but, and why? And then I had a student do a beautiful thing where she was Russian Mennonite and realized that her family's land was appropriated Métis land. And she created, for the assignment, artwork where she combined her Russian Mennonite embroidery traditions with the beadwork that she had learned from me to create pieces of work like these gorgeous pieces that express that kind of problematic of that personal family history. So it's like you give students the tools where they can start to think about these things. And then try to create an environment where it's okay to do that. That's the big thing. It's like, I sometimes have to work on my tolerance for ignorance because after all these years, it's getting a little short. But I have a student right now, I can just feel the resistance coming from the class. I just say something, I could just feel it. And, I'm trying to listen to what she's saying or the reason behind why she's saying it, and not jump on her right away. But it's, you just have to work with it. You can only take people so far also within the frame of a particular semester. Other people have already come in with quite a lot of, experience or exposure. The other thing is you never know, especially in Saskatchewan, you never know. So, you know, someone, you know, the blonde with green eyes in the back of the room might be status. And, you know, some quiet guy, it's like his aunt who he loves is Cree. Like, it's not a blood relationship, it's a kin relationship. Our families and our communities are so interconnected. You can't assume you know who your students are. That's the other thing.
I think we have, with this last conversation, which was a lovely space actually on which to conclude for today, because a space has been created entre toi-même, Pierre-Olivier, Annette and Sherry. Mais sinon, j'aimerais remercier dans ce cas-là Annette de Stecher, Sherry, Farrell, Racette et Pierre-Olivier Ouellet pour notre belle conversation.